Welcome to the last and final lecture for Unit 16 on 20th Century Architecture. The contents of this lecture loosely parallels the readings from Chapter 15 and 16 in your Buildings Across Time book. You should have completed the readings prior to viewing this lecture. As always, you will be tested on content from the reading that is not covered in this lecture. When you're ready to proceed, advance to the next slide. As always, remember to click on the audio icon to receive the audio content for each slide. In the previous lecture, we discussed the three most important architects of the 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier. In this lecture, I'd like to take a look at the key themes of the 20th century, beginning with early 20th century work and continuing through more recent contemporary work. This lecture loosely profiles the readings from chapters 15 and 16 in your Buildings Across Time book. As you review this lecture, and as you read the readings, in particular the reading for chapter 16, it's important to remember that the true historical significance of a work of architecture can only really be judged with the passage of time. So while we have a clear understanding of the historical impact of the early 20th century work, which is now nearly 100 years old, more recent work is perhaps more difficult to judge. In particular, the historical impact of some of the work covered within the last 20 years will only truly be known with some passage of time. Keep this in mind as you review this lecture and complete the readings. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly review some of the key themes of the early 20th century. You should revisit the quotes on this slide that I began the previous lecture with. Remember that architecture is an expression of us, our beliefs, and values at any particular time. The early 20th century architects really believed that each time period was shaped by its own unique zeitgeist, or spirit of the age. So at the beginning of the 20th century, architects thought it was up to them to define what the character of that age would be. The early modern architects would equate ornament to crime, and they would completely rebel against the classical aesthetic. There was a belief that modern architecture was the inevitable, logical product of the intellectual and technological conditions of the age. There was also the belief, and perhaps a utopian goal, that by producing good or morally correct architecture, architects could generate an improved society. The idea that better housing, for example, might reduce child abuse or some other social ill of the time. But most importantly, the 20th century was to be the century of the machine, a century of speed and mobility, and architecture for this new epoch would proclaim the glory of mechanization. One trend that we begin to see at the end of the 19th century is the style of Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is perhaps a precursor to some of the ideas of the early 20th century architects. In particular, the idea of abandoning classical ornamentation and the search for a new style that's fresh and different. Art Nouveau is a highly decorative style that begins about 1880. There's an attempt to produce something exciting and new in Art Nouveau work. The sinuous forms of the late Baroque in Art Nouveau have been developed into a more free-flowing composition, loosely based on plant and animal forms. The skeletal structure of Art Nouveau also takes advantage of new materials, in particular ironwork, which can be easily formed and molded into this language of organic curves. You can see a good example of this in Victor Horta's Tassel House in Belgium. The lobby and stairway are covered with these organic, plant-like, sinuous forms, which are typical to Art Nouveau work. The swirling tendril designs on the floors, walls, and ceiling, and also the structural elements of the staircase, are all related to the style of Art Nouveau. Two more examples of Art Nouveau work can be seen on this slide. The two images on the left are Antonio Gaudi's Casa Mila, located in Barcelona, Spain. Most of Gaudi's work from the beginning of the 20th century in Barcelona can be considered Art Nouveau. In the Casa Mila, we see this undulating plastic facade and these organic, fanciful rooftop sculptures. The image on the right is Hector Guimard's metro entrances. This one in particular is the entrance at the Porte Dauphine. Guimard's work features these wrought iron swirls and curves, some which support this light, delicate glass roof. The key element in all of these examples is the integration of these plant-like organic forms throughout the design, which is the key stylistic element of Art Nouveau work. Another theme that we see at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is that of the arts and crafts movement. Much of Frank Lloyd Wright's early work that we discussed in the Unit 15 lecture is related to the arts and crafts style of architecture. Arts and crafts is a response to the rapid pace of industrialization. There's an attempt to produce a design that's true to its materials and means of construction. Arts and crafts architecture is often expressive of the site and local conditions. There's often a sort of domestic or vernacular feel to the arts and crafts style of architecture. It really reflects the idea of dignity and joy through honest craftsmanship. Is one of the key themes in the arts and crafts style of architecture. And it's an alternative to the mass-produced factory goods of the present time. In Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Glasgow School of Art, we see both arts and crafts as well as Art Nouveau influences. It's related to the Art Nouveau style of architecture with these sort of curved forms that you can see on the windows and the entrance gate that are related to and inspired by natural forms. It's related to the arts and crafts movement with its concern for craftsmanship and materiality. This building features a bold composition of masses with light and airy interiors. Like the Art Nouveau architects, Mackintosh was concerned with the design of furniture, light fixtures, and window details. On the interior spaces, there's a pattern of horizontal and vertical elements. It's probably strongly related to the arts and crafts style of architecture. Both arts and crafts and Art Nouveau existed simultaneously, and both are really precursors to some of the ideas of early modern architecture. In the Glasgow School of Art, we can see both of these things. Forms that are related to the organic plant-like forms found in nature, as well as arts and crafts style forms, which are strongly related to the idea of honesty and craftsmanship, and truth and materiality. The Art Nouveau architects who are based in Austria become collectively known as the Vienna Secession. One of those architects is Otto Wagner, who between 1904 and 1912 builds his postal savings bank in Vienna. Wagner is one of the founders of the Vienna Secession. He was originally a neoclassical architect who undergoes a philosophical shift and begins to produce a more rational modern expression suited to the times. In his postal savings bank, he abandons the Art Nouveau style for something that's much more clean and rational. The postal savings bank has a marble veneer facade that's attached to the building with expressed aluminum-headed bolts, which create this grid-like pattern on the exterior. The idea of an expressed connection, or expressing the tectonics of a building, is a very contemporary and modern idea. The exterior also has an elegant entry canopy created out of aluminum and glass. Aluminum would have been a radical material at the time. On the interior, we also see this machine-age aesthetic expressed, both in terms of the detailing of the columns, the ceiling details, as well as even down to the light fixtures. The light fixtures have this very kind of industrial machine-age aesthetic to them. During the same time, in 1908, another Austrian architect named Adolf Loos writes an important essay called Ornament and Crime. In Ornament and Crime, he equates the ornamentation of a building to that of a tattooed criminal. The idea is that it's a crime to ornament a building. Remember, the architects at this time were trying to very strongly break away from the classical traditions of the past, where the ornamentation of a building was of primary concern. In Ornament and Crime, Adolf Loos argues for an alternative method, an architecture that's free of ornamentation, which becomes a key idea of 20th century architecture. The disciplines of art and architecture are closely related in the 20th century. In the early 20th century, a group of painters in Germany began to revolt against the idea of academic naturalism found in painting at the time. And they sought to express emotions, thoughts, and feelings directly in their paintings. Their work becomes known as Expressionism. The Einstein Tower, by Erich Mendelsohn, is closely related to this expressionist style of painting in Germany. The Einstein Tower is a laboratory which is named for one of the 20th century's foremost scientists, Albert Einstein. It's built of brick, but then covered with stucco to give it this smooth, streamlined appearance. Mendelssohn has an interest in streamlined aerodynamic forms. You can see the expressionist quality of the architecture also strongly represented in Mendelssohn's drawings, as seen on the right. The bold graphic technique of Mendelssohn's sketches displays the powerful and poetic hand of someone forcefully influenced by the act of drawing, and it captures the form and spirit of the Einstein Tower through this style of drawing. The building itself represents the dynamism of the activities that the top scientists in the world are exploring at this time, notably the complex notions of space and time, as captured through these dynamic, streamlined forms. This building is important because the style of architecture is no longer associated with a classical style. Rather, it's attempting to express complex emotions related to the dynamic activities of the top scientists in the world at this time. Another building directly associated with an artistic movement is that of the Schroeder House, designed by the architect Gerrit Rietveld in 1924, located in Utrecht in the Netherlands. This building is part of the De Stijl movement, which means the style. The most famous De Stijl artist is that of Pierre Mondrian. You can see one of Pierre Mondrian's works on the right. Mondrian's works are compositions of planes and linear elements, which usually feature primary colors, black, white, and gray. The Schroeder House can really be seen as a three-dimensional Mondrian painting, which has been translated into livable space. In the Schroeder House, you can see a composition of intersecting planes and linear steel sections. This building must have been a shock to the neighbors in the 1920s. As you can see, it relates in no way to its existing context. I think the quote by Rietveld on this slide really sums up one of the key ideas of early modern architecture. And that's the idea that architecture must reflect the spirit of place and time. You remember, the early 20th century architects were trying to break away from the styles of the past. They were trying to create an architecture that was uniquely associated with the early 20th century, a century that was defined at this time by the Industrial Revolution. And they wanted to create an architecture that represented the spirit of that place and time. Rietveld's quote, and I quote, "We didn't avoid older styles because they were ugly, or because we couldn't reproduce them, but because our own times demanded their own form. I mean, their own manifestation." This idea is one of the key ideas of early modern 20th century architecture. This quote by Walter Gropius also echoes a similar theme about architecture's search for an appropriate form for its time and place. He says, "Modern man, who no longer dresses in historic garments but wears modern clothes, also needs a modern house appropriate to him and his time." In the previous unit, I talked about the three probably most famous architects of the 20th century, Frank Lloyd Wright, Mies van der Rohe, and Le Corbusier. But if I were to talk about the three most important architects of the 20th century when it comes to the international style of architecture, I would have discussed Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius, in 1926, designs the School of the Bauhaus, which is an art and architecture school located in Dessau in Germany. In 1919, Gropius was invited to take over the School of Arts and Crafts at Weimar, which later becomes known as the Bauhaus. Both the school and the building really represent the modern struggle to find an appropriate aesthetic for an industrialized world. The Bauhaus is founded with the purpose of exploring industrial production and artistic expression, and its teachings would really define the modern movement. Students at the Bauhaus were challenged to create designs not based on historical precedents, but rather inspired by the nature of materials and the technology of production. Gropius was in charge of creating the Bauhaus and set its charge to train students in all aspects of design for industrial production, with an emphasis on craft. At the Bauhaus, they would educate students through hands-on techniques in wood, metal, weaving, pottery, painting, and drawing, and theory. This was a sharp break from the École des Beaux-Arts training methods, which were popular in Europe at the time, which focused heavily on the study of classical architecture. The building that Gropius designed for the Bauhaus contains all the elements of what becomes known as the International Style, which are simple geometries, volumetric masses, a thin skin, in this case the use of a curtain wall, and a building that's without detail or ornamentation of any kind. These are the key elements in International Style architecture, and Gropius was one of the International Style's loudest supporters. The building itself is an asymmetrical, sprawling complex. It has a bit of form follows function. There's a separate articulation and mass for each program element in the building, which results in this abstract, almost pinwheel-like composition. The workshops would have been in one wing, the classrooms would have been in another wing, and the student housing is in the third wing, connected by circulation and the administrative offices. The building itself is meant to be a total work of art, and it's really meant to represent the ideas of the school itself. It uses industrial materials, concrete and glass, applied without any ornamentation. Its circulation is clearly expressed in its form. Another quote by Gropius, he says, "At the Bauhaus believes the machine to be our modern medium of design, and seeks to come to terms with it." You can see in the image in the lower right, which is the workshop wing, the walls are entirely made of glass. It's fully transparent. The glass is suspended away from the concrete structure behind it. This wing was really intended to be a model of what all architecture should become in the future. Like Mies van der Rohe, Gropius is important for spreading the ideas of the early modern movement, because Gropius also leaves Germany during World War II and ends up teaching at Harvard. So both Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius end up being strong supporters of what becomes known as the International Style. Both of them are internationally influential because they're both associated not only with their work in Germany pre-World War II, but also with the schools that they teach at post-World War II. Mies van der Rohe coming to Chicago to teach at IIT, and Walter Gropius, who ends up at Harvard. Because of that, the International Style becomes a worldwide phenomena, and International Style buildings, like its name implies, becomes a style that could be applied internationally, all over the world, to all different types of scenarios. The International Style of architecture was meant to be universal. The idea of the International Style was that it was really the morally correct, industrialized architecture appropriate for the early 20th century that could be universally applied pretty much throughout the world. Not all architects at this time, however, totally buy into this idea. You can see this in the work of Alvar Aalto. Alvar Aalto's work is clearly inspired by the International Style of architecture, but Aalto becomes known for taking a much more regional approach to applying the ideas of International Style to his work. You can see this in his Villa Morea, located in Finland, built between 1937 and 1939. The Villa Morea is really a grand version of the Nordic summer cottage. It's surrounded by a continuous pine forest. The clients for this building wanted a house that was both modern as well as Finnish at the same time. The client is an artist, and the house was developed around the idea of blurring the activity of painting with the rituals of daily life. The forms for the Villa Marea are inspired by nature and that of modern painting, and the house really becomes a composition. The house represents a synthesis of both modernity and traditional forms. It has a very modern, open plan that's combined with the poles from traditional farmhouses. The columns for the structure, no two are alike, and the columns really become an abstraction of the Finnish pine forest. Aalto is trying to avoid architectural rhythms in favor of a more natural rhythm. You can see this in the composition of poles located both under the entry canopy as well as at the main stairs. This composition of vertical poles really becomes an echo of the natural rhythms of the Finnish pine forest. Aalto uses the technique of collage, as it would have been used in paintings, to combine fragments designed to bring to mind memories of nature and traditional Finnish buildings, among other things. You can see this in the composition of elements in the Villa Marea. The sauna is the first element in the composition, and it's built in a very traditional form. But the traditional sauna gradually transforms as it approaches the house into a much more white box, international style, modern composition. In this building, Aalto is looking for a new type of individualism, a house that responds to the age of the machine, and individual desires of the client, and the individuality of its particularly unique location. This is something not seen in the universal aspect of international style architecture. Aalto's quote on this page really sums up kind of these three ideas. He says, "The architect's task is to restore a correct order of values. It is still the architect's duty to attempt to humanize the age of machines, but this should not be done without regard to form." You can see in this quote, Aalto is still influenced by the idea of the morally correct architecture of the international style, this idea of restoring the correct order of values through architecture. But he also speaks to the idea of humanizing the age of machine, something that's a little bit more natural and regional than the kind of cold, white compositions of true international style architecture. And he's also expressing a desire in this quote to manipulate form, the way a painter or a collage artist might combine forms together to create an emotive quality. By the time we reach the 1950s, we begin to see more diverging ideas in architecture, as the strict rules of the international style become less universally applied, and architects begin to search for their own unique expression. We can see this in Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal, which was built from 1956 to 1962 in New York City, at New York's Kennedy Airport. Saarinen creates a building that's suggestive of the miracle of flight. The building is a composition or a cluster of thin concrete shells, which are cantilevered out from central feet. In the elevation, which you can see in the upper left, the profile of the building almost looks like a bird with outstretched wings. This building is inspired by earlier Expressionist work, such as that of Erich Mendelsohn. If you remember, Expressionist architecture is expressive of emotions, and this building in particular evokes the idea of flight through the use of its curved, fluid, and cantilevered forms. Another building by the architect Eero Saarinen is the John Deere & Company headquarters, located in Moline, Illinois, which was designed in 1963. This building is the headquarters for a farm equipment manufacturer, and it pioneered the use of weathering steel, a type of steel known as Corten steel. Corten steel is a high tensile steel that, if left unpainted, forms its own cinnamon brown protective coating. In other words, as the steel rusts, it actually protects itself from oxidation, unlike other types of steel, which would deteriorate when it rusts. This particular building is set on a wooded site, with 2 man-made lakes and 3 original buildings, an auditorium, an office building, and a display building. The office building and the display building were connected by a bridge, which spanned across a ravine. This building has a facade that's articulated by external louvers, which are hung from extending steel beams. It's known for its expressive steel detailing. This type of expressive detailing is also somewhat reminiscent to the type of detailing that would be found on a Japanese temple. For those of you who are local to the Chicago area, you might recognize Corten steel. It's used on the Picasso sculpture in downtown Chicago, as well as on the Daly Center, which is located directly adjacent to the Picasso sculpture. But it's Eero Saarinen's John Deere & Company building that really first popularized this material as a building material for architecture. If you remember back to the previous lecture, we talked about the architect Le Corbusier and how he liked to use exposed concrete in some of his work, a material that he referred to as béton brut, and how Corbusier's use of béton brut would later influence a style of architecture known as brutalism. Well, the image shown on this slide is a prime example of the style of architecture that's known as brutalism. This is the Yale School of Art and Architecture by the architect Paul Rudolph. It's one of the primary buildings in a style of architecture called brutalism. This building features rugged, cubic, and rectilinear forms. If you see in the detail image, these strong vertical striations of the corduroy textured surfaces are obtained by pouring concrete into vertically ribbed wooden forms. The forms are then stripped away, and the concrete edges are hand-hammered to expose the aggregate. This was Rudolph's favorite treatment for exposed concrete surfaces, because it created interesting surfaces. Rudolph was interested in the drama of natural light, and how that was captured across the surface. But he also liked this technique because it controlled the staining and minimized the effects of discoloration that are inherent in concrete construction. On the interior of the building, there are 37 level changes to accommodate functional and circulation areas. And since the walls on the inside are de-emphasized, the levels are defined principally by floor and ceiling planes. Rudolph's been criticized for a number of serious functional shortcomings in this building. Some of the criticisms include the fact that he put the areas he cared the least about in the basement, the fact that he put the painters in areas where they were exposed to south light, that he put the sculptors in the sculpture studios in areas that had low ceilings and were cave-like spaces, and of course that the best spaces were reserved for architectural activities. Another key figure in 20th century architecture is the architect Louis Kahn. In these images you can see his Salk Institute, which was designed between 1959 and 1962. Kahn viewed the purpose of architecture as elevating human institutions and human activity to an almost metaphysical or spiritual level. For this building, Kahn's client was the scientist Jonas Salk, who discovered the polio vaccine. Salk shared Kahn's view of incorporating a kind of majestic mystery into the design of a laboratory building. This project is a laboratory building which features a U-shaped courtyard. The two main masses flanking the courtyard are the laboratory floors, and the smaller buildings on either side of the courtyard are the researchers' individual studies or office spaces, which you can see in the image on the lower right. These office buildings Kahn referred to as porticos of study, and each were designed so that they had a framed view toward the Pacific Ocean beyond. Kahn used the teak panels to contrast the stark concrete in the composition of these office studies. This is a monument to the celebration of human reason, and it recognizes that part of the scientific inquiry is contemplating the extended impact one is making on nature. Because of this, the key space in the Salk Institute is this courtyard, with this very thin, elegant water feature, which symbolically connects the laboratory building, the courtyard, and the scientists to the larger context of the Pacific Ocean beyond. Kahn's work has a monumentality that's been inspired by history, and his work often has a feeling of a ruin, as if you're encountering some kind of ancient Greek temple site. His work has a monumentality that's not seen in earlier 20th century work. It's one of the features that makes Kahn's work symbolic and important. His work is known for the poetry of the situation, as well as the monumentality of the architecture. Another important building by Louis Kahn is the Kimball Art Museum, located in Fort Worth, Texas, built between 1967 and 1972. Again, Kahn is known for both the poetics of his architecture as well as the sense of monumentality. In this building, he uses the barrel vault, which is reminiscent of some ancient Roman structure. Kahn was known to have admired the monumentality of Roman architecture. But in this building, the barrel vault's built out of concrete, which is one of the key 20th century building materials. Kahn says, space is not a space unless you can see the evidence of how it was made. And in this building, he's celebrating the 20th century material of cast-in-place concrete through this cast barrel vaulted space. This building is a composition of 16 barrel vaulted units. The barrel vault is both the key structural unit as well as the key spatial unit. In other words, the vault becomes both structure and space simultaneously. Another key factor in the work of Louis Kahn is the use of natural light. In particular, light to create and define a poetic experience. Kahn's interested in the play of light and shadow on elemental or basic geometric forms. And in this building, it's the barrel vault and the way that barrel vault captures light that becomes important. The barrel vault in this building is actually two cantilevers, which meet at a continuous skylight in the center. Below the skylight are these reflector shields, which both control the UV light, which can be damaging to the artwork, as well as bounce the light down the inside of the vaulted space, which really defines the space with this poetic experience. This creates a space that's neutral enough for a gallery space, but also flexible enough for a rich and dynamic spatial experience. The skylight and the vault, and the way light is cascading down the inside of the vault, creates a space where light is responsive to every nuance of changing exterior conditions. And the light becomes the primary spatial experience. It enhances the space. The way Kahn uses structure and light are two key factors that defines the architecture of Louis Kahn. His quote says, "Structure is the maker of light, because structure releases the space between, and that is light-giving." So in Kahn's work, in particular one of his masterpieces, the Kimball Art Museum, you can see these two elements together, structure, truth in materials, and light, to create a poetic architectural experience. By the second half of the 20th century, the ideals of early modern architecture start to become increasingly challenged. And we see something called postmodernism, which is quite different than the thinking of the international style. In 1966, the architect Robert Venturi writes a book called Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. It's probably the most important writing on architecture since Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, 40 years earlier, and it represents the beginnings of postmodernism. Venturi discards the orderly purity and pristine character of modernism. And in his book, he begins to reveal the inconsistencies and ambiguities of the work of Palladio and Michelangelo, and he glorifies Mannerists and Baroque architecture. He celebrates the idea of the ugly and the ordinary aspects of 20th century buildings. He addresses the Miesian dictum of less is more by countering it with less is a bore. And he sees historical references that modernism was totally against now seem less important. Some architects even begin to view history as an opportunity for diversity. So, postmodernism, we see historical references and an increasing concern for site-specific buildings begin to set up another radical change in architecture. In this image, you can see Robert Venturi's Chestnut Hill House, which is located outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which was designed in 1961. Venturi worked under Kahn and Saarinen. He thought that architecture should deal with illusion and symbolism, and the references should derive from or relate to the social and historical context of the buildings. So in this building we have a simple exterior form that's combined with a complex interior layout. There's all kinds of contradictory arrangements in this building. For example, we have sort of a reference to a traditional house form with this pitched roof. But the pitch of the roof that you see on the front is not actually the line of the roof behind it. You also have these references to a kind of classical temple front facade. And there's an implied symmetry, but it's not symmetrical. Even the doorway, which is centered under the arch in the middle, the door isn't centered on that space. It's kind of jammed into the corner. And even the driveway which approaches the building is slightly off-center from this kind of symmetrical entryway. Even the pitch of this kind of portico roof doesn't meet in the center. It's broken intentionally. So we see that Venturi's playing on our expectations of these kind of traditional house forms as well as kind of classical architectural forms, and then introducing contradictions into the composition. In his quote he says, "I like elements which are hybrid rather than pure, compromising rather than clean, distorted rather than straightforward, ambiguous rather than articulated, perverse as well as impersonal, boring as well as interesting, conventional rather than designed, accommodating rather than excluding, redundant rather than simple, vestigial as well as invigorating, inconsistent and equivocal rather than direct and clear. I am for messy vitality over obvious unity." In other words, Venturi is arguing against everything that modern architecture was. Early modernism was pure, straightforward, direct and clear, unified. Venturi's arguing for something that's a little bit more complex and contradictory, something that's more dynamic, as well as an architecture that isn't afraid to reference historical architecture. In the end, Venturi is ultimately probably more influential through his writings than his architecture. The writings of Robert Venturi would really come to influence an entire style of architecture known as postmodernism. If you remember back to our study of early modern architecture, the early modernists at the beginning of the 20th century didn't want anything to do with any sort of association with classical architecture. They were completely against the use of classical forms or any historical associations. They even wrote essays and manifestos equating the ornamentation of a building with a crime. Postmodernism is very different. One of the key postmodern buildings is Michael Graves' Portland building, located in Portland, Oregon, designed in 1980. Graves describes the elements of his buildings as traceable to classical forms. You can see abstractions of giant keystones, fluted vertical pilasters. There's even a reference to a tiered temple base. All the forms in this building are traceable to classical architectural vocabularies, but they've all been abstracted into simplified geometric forms. And we can also see the introduction of color. These historical references, as well as the use of color, is something very different than early modern architecture. Postmodern buildings aren't afraid to look back to classical references as inspiration. As we get into the last third of the 20th century, we're going to start to see an increasing amount of diverging ideas. So at the exact same time that we see the rise and the height of postmodernism architecture, we also see the exact opposite happening. A style of architecture known as high-tech, or structural expressionism. In this style of architecture, the structural and the mechanical aspects of the building are the focus, rather than the formal allusions or allegories that are popular in postmodernism. This building is a good example, the Lloyd's Building in London by Richard Rogers, which was designed between 1979 and 1984. In this building, it's essentially, has the aesthetic of a large machine. And the primary aesthetic feature of the building is the structural system, which has been expressed on the exterior, as well as the mechanical systems, which are expressed on the exterior, and expressed as the primary aesthetic or formal feature of the architecture. Another example of high-tech architecture, or structural expressionism, is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, located in Hong Kong, China, by the architect Norman Foster, which again is the exact same time period, 1979 to 1986. The goal of this building was to create the best bank building in the world, and the project addresses the nature of banking in Hong Kong and how it should be expressed in built form. And in doing so, Norman Foster virtually reinvents the office tower in this building. The requirements were to build in excess of 1 million square feet in a short time span, suggested a high degree of prefabrication. And this building includes factory-finished modules. In addition, the need to build both downwards and upwards simultaneously, due to the tight time constraints, led to the adoption of a suspension structure, with pairs of steel masts arranged in 3 bays. The building has an exoskeleton, almost like an insect. The service elements rise on the short ends and are expressed in the facade. There's also an open plaza on the ground floor below, with escalators that rise through a glass ceiling. On the exterior, the structural trusses are expressed and become the primary elements in the aesthetic and the form of the building. By using these structural trusses on the exterior, the architect was able to create a column-free interior, which was essentially created by stacking these bridge-like structures one on top of the other. The double-height spaces that you can see on the exterior facade are spaces for meeting rooms and recreation spaces. Again, this building is another prime example of high-tech architecture. Architecture where the mechanical systems, the structural systems, and the circulation systems are the primary aesthetic or formal feature. Another thing happening at the exact same time are architects who are still producing architecture that's strongly associated to the ideas of the early modernists. I like to think of these architects as sort of the second-generation modernists, where the ideas of the international style, Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, are reinterpreted in a slightly more dynamic way, but still have the same basic beliefs of the early architecture of the 20th century. Of these architects, Richard Meier is probably the most important, and you can see these things here in his Athenaeum building, located in New Harmony, Indiana. This building really continues the earlier traditions of modernism. Meier owes really an obvious debt to the work of Le Corbusier. In fact, he uses this Corbusian type of cubical massing, except he often introduced a slight kind of gentle curve into the form. Meier also claims to be influenced by the spatial layering and light quality in Baroque interiors, and because of this, his work is always white. He uses white metal panels as a way to reflect light into the interior of the building. The natural light is introduced in his work and reflected off of the shiny white exterior, which creates a dynamic spatial interior character. In his Athenaeum building, which is located in New Harmony, Indiana, this building is the starting point for a tour of this historic town, and the building is intended to serve as a visitor center and orientation, as well as a cultural center for community events. Again, during the exact same time period, we can see architects who are still influenced by the ideas of modernism, but perhaps taking a much more minimal approach to the ideas of modernist architecture. We can see this in the work of Tado Ando in his Koshino house located in Japan, built between 1979 and 1984. This building is essentially 3 volumes, an office volume, a living space volume, and a bedroom space volume. So it's essentially a studio residence. It uses very simple, pure geometries, similar to early modernist architecture, but probably even more minimal in its composition. Ando uses concrete in all of his buildings because he thinks it's the most important material of the 20th century. But he tries to use concrete in a way that no other person can use it. He's created his own special mixture of concrete, which turns the concrete into an almost beautiful and sensuous material on the interior space. He's also interested in the use of light, And in most of Ando's buildings, you get this dramatic quality of light that's washed along the materiality of the concrete, whereas light is almost sculpted as if it's a building material, controlled through apertures in the roof of the building. Ando's work is also often very inward-focusing, where the building turns inside on itself to create a serene and peaceful environment, an environment that separates the user and the architecture from the chaos of the contemporary city. Another style of architecture which begins to be developed around the 1980s and really continues through the 1990s is that of deconstructivism, or deconstruction. Deconstruction really develops from French philosophy, in particular the philosophy of the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who was interested in deconstructing literary texts to try to locate or find their hidden meanings. In architecture, the term deconstruction refers to a style of architecture that emphasizes fragmentation and dislocation rather than traditional unity and synthesis. Because of these kind of jarring forms that deconstruction is known for, many people have been critical of this style. But some argue that the style promotes a serious and necessary criticism of the unbridled consumer culture and media-driven hyper-reality of the world that we live in. Deconstruction is also a reaction against postmodernism. To sum up some of these ideas, I'd like to read you a quote by the architect Wolf Pree from the firm Koop Himmelblau, who wrote an essay in 1980 called Architecture Must Blaze, which really sums up kind of the ideas of deconstructivism. He says, "We are tired of seeing Palladio and other historical masks, because we don't want architecture to exclude everything that is disquieting. We want architecture to have more. We want architecture that bleeds, that exhausts, that revolves, and even breaks. Architecture that burns, that stings, that rips, that tears under stress." These are really the ideas of deconstructivist architecture. And whether you like the forms or not, the ideas really come out of the messiness and fragmentation of the contemporary world that we live in. A good example of deconstructivist architecture is Bernard Tschumi's Parc de la Villette, located in Paris. Tschumi won the competition for the Parc de la Villette in 1982, and it was one of Paris's grand projets under former President François Mitterrand. The competition called for the design of a park for the 21st century. And in Tschumi's park, he uses three concepts: points, lines, and surfaces. The points, which you can see in red, create a grid on 120-meter intervals, which is superimposed on the park. At each grid point, there's a folly, which is essentially a 10 by 10 by 10 meter cube, designed to give identity to an otherwise ill-defined site. Each of the follies are essentially deconstructed 9 square cubes, and they can be modified for a variety of solutions throughout the park. Some become cafes, some become theater spaces, and some are just architectural follies. The second concept is that of lines. The lines connect the spaces of the park and become the major circulation spines within the composition. And the last idea is surfaces. There are a variety of park surface treatments and gardens designed throughout the park. These surfaces really create a cinematic narrative, almost like scenes in a movie throughout the park, which create a narrative of spaces. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, I think it's difficult to really understand the historical importance of more recent work. The reality is that only time will tell how historically important some of the more recent works of architecture, especially those done within the last 10 to 20 years, will ultimately become. Chapter 16 of the Buildings Across Time book does try to discuss the historical relevance of work that's quite recent. And the authors of that book probably will do a better job than I will at it. So instead of trying to make any historical assessment of more recent work, I thought I would leave you with this slide, which has a number of buildings built within the last 15 to 20 years, and try to just identify some simple themes related to work that's happening currently. The first image is of the Milwaukee Art Museum by Santiago Calatrava. Calatrava is an engineer and an architect. His work is often very structurally expressive, I think relating to the idea of structural expressionism that we talked about earlier in this lecture. But his work often also uses this kind of poetic sense of light. In his work, structure, repetition, and light seem to be important key themes. The next image is the Jewish Museum by Daniel Libeskind. This building has a very fragmented angular form, which I think comes out of the history of deconstructionism. In this case, these forms seem somewhat appropriate for a building that is about a very fragmented historical time in the history of Berlin, primarily that of the Holocaust. The third image is the Marne School of Architecture by Bernard Tschumi. I think in this building, Tschumi is continuing some of his ideas of this sort of expressive architecture related to deconstructivism. The building also tries to become a place for events, having an over-dramatic circulation system that tries to encourage interaction within the users of the building to promote learning and ideas. The building has an almost high-tech, structurally expressive feel to it, based on its use of materiality. The next image is the McCormick Tribune Campus Center at IIT by Rem Koolhaas. Rem Koolhaas's work is very much related to contemporary ideas about the site and the city. In this building, it's said that Koolhaas took the circulation paths that were on the site, that were just dirt paths on the grass site that were existing, and turned those into the organization for the building. The building also aesthetically celebrates the elevated train, which passes right over it with this very dramatic tube-like form, and the Tribune Campus Center kind of slides underneath it in this interesting way. Going down to the next row, the Arab Institute by Jean Nouvel in Paris, France in 1987. This building has a kind of high-tech, structurally expressive feel to it, but it's primarily about light. The facade is made of these thousands of apertures which open and close to regulate light based on the exterior conditions of light on any given day. Jean Nouvel's work, most of it is very contemporary and expressive in terms of high-tech materiality, but it almost always has to do with light in some sort of poetic way as well. The Fano Science Center by Zaha Hadid. I think much of Zaha Hadid's work is related to these kind of interesting geometries which are manipulated by digital technology. A lot of her work is exploring how to push the boundaries of geometry and form through the use of the computer. But at the same time, circulation is very important in most of her work, and in this case she brings an urban plaza directly underneath the building to create a new type of urban space and draw circulation and movement through the building. The Monument to the Murdered Jews of Europe by Peter Eisenman, located in Berlin from 2007, is a really dramatic piece of architecture. Eisenman's work is most closely associated with deconstruction because Eisenman's one of the few architects that actually collaborated with the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, even though Eisenman almost always denies the fact that his work is related to deconstruction. His work generally is associated with it, probably in the most obvious way. This project features nearly 3,000 stela, or concrete markers, located over a large site in Berlin, and is really a memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. The next building is the Caltrans building by Morphosis. The architect Tom Main of Morphosis is very closely associated in his earlier work with the ideas of deconstruction. And while their work has moved beyond that in more recent years, you still see this highly layered, articulated, fragmented geometry, which I think is related, historically at least, to some of the ideas of deconstruction, but is also related to contemporary life in terms of speed and movement, complexity. Frank Gehry's work obviously is very sculpturally expressive, as you can see in his Disney Concert Hall from 2003. Most of his work is known for taking architecture and treating it almost as if it's a plastic sculpture. His work is also associated with digital technologies because most of the forms that he's exploring simply could not be built without the use of high-tech computer software, both to model and understand the forms as well as to construct them. The Kunsthaus Graz by Peter Cook falls into a line of buildings that became popular in the early 2000s, known as blobs. Some people refer to this style of architecture as blobitecture, but really it relates to these forms that are exploring digital technologies. A number of architects at this time really believed that the computer was not just a tool, but perhaps a new medium in architecture, and that architecture should reflect the types of shapes and forms that could only be understood, visualized, and conceptually created with the use of digital technologies. The Kunsthaus Graz tries to push the limits of digital form making and explores the idea of direct CAD to manufacturing processes, where the forms that were modeled in the computer are directly linked to, CAD/CAM technology that can manufacture these pieces. The Free University Library of Norman Foster. We talked about Foster's work earlier being related to structural expressionism in the 1980s. His more recent work, I think, draws or continues some of those ideas, but also becomes very interested in sustainability. This building features a double-skin facade that actually breathes and regulates the temperature, so that for 60% of the year, this building can be controlled by natural ventilation alone in terms of its heating and cooling, and saves a tremendous amount of energy over a traditional library building. And finally, the Art Institute in Chicago by Renzo Piano. Piano's work is known for its kind of honest craft and construction, creating these elegant modern forms out of the art and tectonics of putting buildings together. At the Art Institute of Chicago, it's known for this flying carpet roof form, which is this very elegant, structurally expressive form that also controls and filters and regulates light for the museum gallery spaces below. So these are just a few things that have been happening recently. Again, the historical importance of these things will only be truly understood after a significant time has passed, and we look back to understand which of these buildings and which of these styles and trends really have had a historical and meaningful impact on the history of architecture. And finally, to finish this last lecture, and really to sum up this course in general, I'd like to leave you with the last paragraph from a book called Understanding Architecture, written by Leland Roth. I think this paragraph sums up this course, why architecture matters, and why we study the history of architecture. Roth says, "Architecture is the art we cannot escape. It is over, under, and around us virtually every second of our lives. An architecture of substance is more than simply a benevolent protective umbrella. At its best, it interacts with us on our behalf, allowing us to become more human. It is far more than shelter, more than a commodity for speculation. It is the built record of how we have ordered our cultural priorities, of who and what we are, and what we believe in. It is our testament in stone. What, then, is the testament we are building today?"